First, we're going to just talk about some basic nutritional things. Next, we're going to talk about the idea of medicinal mushrooms. People talk a lot about medicinal mushrooms without really much definition, and so we're going to explore that a little bit and try and make a bit of sense out of that, or at least I'll show you what I've tried to make sense out of it. And then we're going to talk about another concept that for me actually may work a little better, which is the idea of mushrooms as functional foods, which is a term that some nutritionists and workers in that field use. So I will describe all that stuff and we'll go ahead and get started. So first, I always like to have basic background stuff. Start from the beginning. So what are mushrooms? Okay, mushrooms are reproductive structures. There are two groups of fungi that make mushrooms. They're called Ascomycota and Basidiomycota, and I'll just give you a brief definition of what those are in a second. And mushrooms are just the reproductive structures, okay? So Basidiomycota, the spores are made, if we were to look, so just this group first, there's about 30,000 described species. They're not all mushrooms. Most mushrooms are in this group. If you were to look on the side of one of these gills, you would find cells that look like this. They make their spores out in the open. That cell's called a basidium. And so that's what defines this group. And again, most of the large fleshy fungi are in this group, okay? Then the other group are Ascomyces, Ascomycota. They make their spores a different way. This is actually the largest group of fungi, so there's about 60,000 described species, but most of those are molds. So most of those don't make big structures that are mushrooms. So things like penicillium mold is in this group. Brewer's yeast is in this group. And these make their spores a different way. So the spores are actually enclosed in little tiny sacs, these long skinny sacs, rather than out in the open. So that defines this group. And then there's so mushrooms in this group obviously are morels and truffles and cup fungi. And if you were to look on the surface of that cup fungi microscopically, that's where you'd see these little sacs that have spores in them. So that's that group. And then depending on who you like to read, there's maybe about another half dozen different phyla of fungi, but they don't make large structures, okay? So there are lots of mushrooms that are cultivated for food. Some of these you may know, some you may not. In addition, there are a large number of species that can't be cultivated, things that are mycorrhizal, things like chanterelles and porcini that need a forest, that need that intimate mycorrhizal connection with roots, and we haven't been able to reproduce that in a lab. And actually, for those species, we haven't even been able to reproduce it taking seedlings and trying to inoculate and plant out a forest. That hasn't worked for most of these things, too. So now we've talked about mushrooms. Let's get into basic nutritional stuff, okay? So I'm going to give you the bottom line first, and then we're going to drill down into it. So mushrooms are about 90% water. They're really low in calories, low in fat. They don't have any cholesterol, high in protein. They've got good vitamins and minerals, and good dietary fiber. And now I'm going to show a slide. Okay. The first rule of giving talks to a group like this is never show a slide like this, okay? This is sort of, especially after lunch in a dark room, a lot of you will just have a pleasant nap. I'll try and remember when to wake you up for the good parts in a minute. Okay, we won't go through all these numbers, I promise. This table is from the USDA, okay? And it's talking about 100 grams of mushrooms, which is about 1/4 pound, okay? So we've got, on the top here, we've got our white button mushroom, and then a couple of other cultivated species, shiitake and oyster, and then a couple of wild species, chanterelles and morels. And you can see, if we just look, if 100 grams of mushrooms, 90 plus, right around 90 grams are water. Okay, so they really are 90% water. Okay, and in terms of low calories, here's calories. You can see these numbers are really low. For comparison, 100 grams of carrots which is considered to be a pretty low-calorie food, is more than this, right? So 100 grams of carrots is 41 calories. So these are really, really small numbers. So there's very few calories in mushrooms. Okay. Now the first thing you do is you throw it in butter or olive oil and saute them. So, but you can control that. You can control how much you add. So that is within your purview. Okay. Protein is also pretty good. Remember, we're talking just 10 grams dry weight. So we've got a significant amount of protein that's left. Very little fat, and a good source of fiber, which is important for our guts, important for gut health. We could go on and on. A huge problem in Western diets is the development of diverticulosis from having insufficient fiber in our diet, and it's good for things besides that. Okay, so that's the basic stuff. Here's another table, sorry. This time we're going to talk about minerals, and I've got recommended dietary allowances. Okay, so we have something to compare these numbers to, and I promise we're not going through all the numbers, okay, I promise. We're just gonna focus on a couple. So for example, let's look at iron. How much iron people need in their diets is really variable depending on how old you are and also your gender. Okay, so people need different amounts of iron. But if we just look across at these mushrooms, we can see that iron is pretty high. And actually, look here in morels, it's really high. This is a really rich source of iron. And I have to wonder if that's partly helps explain the really meaty flavor that morels have. I think that may be a component of that. So mushrooms are high in potassium, which we need. Potassium is helpful to have in the diet. So, roughly 10% of your potassium needs are met from this serving of mushroom, and really low in sodium, right? Sodium is salt. We tend to get too much of it in our diets. For some people, they actually need to restrict sodium intake. So you're not getting any, basically, in mushrooms until you add the salt. So again, that's something you can control. You can control how much salt you add. And then some other metals, I skipped zinc, but it's a source of zinc. Copper, you can see it's a significant source of copper. And then also selenium. Selenium is a trace nutrient. So you can see here the units are micrograms rather than milligrams, and mushrooms can be a good source of that as well. Okay, this is my last table, I promise. So this is vitamins now, and I'm just going to focus on a few. So mushrooms are good for some vitamins, but not all. For example, they have almost no vitamin C. Okay, so vitamin C is not even on this list. Okay, but they're good for some of the B vitamins. So here's a couple of B vitamins, and you can see if you just glance at these numbers that it's a significant source. The other thing I want to focus on is vitamin D, and some of you may know this story. I actually have two different units because some people like to use micrograms and some people like to use international units, so I've put it both ways, and here's the recommended amounts. And what you'll see as you go across this table is our cultivated species have an amount that's not super high. And then when we get to the wild species, it bumps way up. Okay, so there's a really big difference between wild species and cultivated species in how much vitamin D they have, which begs the question, why? Why do wild mushrooms have more vitamin D than cultivated mushrooms? Okay, so I'm done with tables now, so those of you who are napping, you can go ahead and wake up. Okay, it's time to wake up. Pretend you're back in the sunlight. So it turns out sunlight is a key element for why wild mushrooms have significant vitamin D, but cultivated ones don't. I'm going to talk about some compounds that were initially discovered in this poisonous fungus called ergot. So those of you who were at Dr. Nichols' talk last night saw some gory pictures of people with gangrene after being poisoned from ergot. It's a very toxic compound, and in the early part of the 20th century, lots of chemistry was done to try and figure out what are the poisons in this fungus that are killing people. And so they identified the toxins, and they identified a whole bunch of other compounds, and it turns out a lot of the things that they identified are actually in all fungi and are not toxic. So one of the things that are in all fungi pretty much is a compound called ergosterol. So ergosterol is what mushrooms have instead of cholesterol. Okay, and actually soil scientists will often use soil ergosterol measurements as a measurement of how much fungi are in soil. So it can be used as a proxy for fungus. But in this case, it turns out, so let me just back up too. Cholesterol we think of as being bad for us, but actually you need some of it. So if you don't get any cholesterol in your diet, your liver will actually synthesize it. So it's actually required for life. It's just that we get too much of it. And it's part of cell membranes, and fungi use a different sterol for their cell membranes. It's healthy for us. But the key feature is that it's photosensitive. If you expose ergosterol to ultraviolet light, it gets converted to ergocalciferol, another ergo compound, which is vitamin D2. So just being out in the sunlight, some of the ergosterol gets converted to vitamin D2. And this is the only non-animal source of vitamin D. Okay, mushrooms are the only non-animal source. So for those of you who are vegans or vegetarians, you may be interested. And it's really similar to how we make vitamin D when you walk out into the sunshine. We have a very similar sterol precursor that gets converted to vitamin D. And although cultivated mushrooms don't have much, you can bump it up just by taking them out into the sunlight. So you can actually take harvested mushrooms, slice them up, bring them outside, put them in the sun for a few minutes, and their vitamin D content will go up. Here's actually a study that was done where they took mushrooms and just pulsed them with ultraviolet light, and the vitamin D content goes from about nothing up to really significant levels, and the quality of the mushrooms was totally fine. So you can give yourself a free boost of vitamin D. Okay, so some other features of mushrooms. Many of us love the way mushrooms taste, right? There's just a really rich, savory, meaty, satisfying flavor from mushrooms. Here I say that it's a good source of umami. So many of you may know that we have 4 major tastes: salty, sweet, sour, bitter, but there's also a 5th one called umami, from a Japanese word for deliciousness. It's a sort of just a really rich character. The amino acid glutamic acid is the main source of that. Anyway, mushrooms are big in umami and this sort of delicious flavor. And that seems to mean that mushrooms can be really satisfying for us without delivering a lot of calories. And that can be a good strategy for people who are on diets that want to lose weight. Many of us in America have more calories than we need. So here's a study that came out of Johns Hopkins a few years ago, where they fed people lunch for 2 weeks. Okay, so whoever said there's no such thing as free lunch, you just have to enroll in a study like this. And they did give people free lunch for 2 weeks. And let me just read the title for you: Lack of Energy Compensation Over 4 Days When White Button Mushrooms Are Substituted for Beef. So they took volunteers, they gave them lunches that were made either with lean ground beef or with ground mushrooms, and they were the same recipes, and they were things like sloppy joes or lasagna, or they had a set thing. And 1 week they served people the mushroom version, and the next week they served people the meat version. And they wanted to know a bunch of things. So people had to fill out questionnaires and checklists. And one thing was, are the mushroom versions tasty? Are they okay? Would you eat this? And the other thing they wanted to know is, did you stay full after you ate it? Because you're not getting as much calories. The meals that they served with mushrooms were less than half the calories of the other meals. So they made you keep track of everything else you ate the rest of the day, and did that for the whole week. Because what you might imagine is if you have a really low-calorie meal, then you're just going to go out and eat a bunch more later, right, to make up your calories for the day. But in fact, that's not what they found. So the mushroom meals had less than half the calories. People felt full and satisfied after the meal, and they didn't eat more later. Okay, so that was a big surprise, and it really gave this group the encouragement to take on another study. So this is positive effect of mushrooms substituted for meat or on body weight, body consumption, health parameter, a randomized clinical trial, 1 year randomized clinical trial. So we're going to go through this too. They had about 200 volunteers who were trying to lose weight, so people who were actively overweight but wanted to lose weight and enrolled in this trial as a means to do that. And the way this was broken down was that there was a 6-month phase where you were trying to lose weight and a 6-month maintenance phase to see if you just gained it all back as soon as you were off the diet. The randomized aspect of it was that one group was asked to eat 8 ounces of mushrooms 3 times a week, and another group instead was asked to eat 90% lean ground beef 3 times a week, and they gave people vouchers to buy this stuff at the grocery store. Actually, wouldn't go very far, but they gave them a little bit to encourage them to. And they met weekly, and they had counseling. So the counselors would tell them all the standard dietary stuff. Try and get more exercise. Limit portion size. All basic dietary advice. And the thing was that the counselors gave the same advice to everybody. They didn't know what people were on the mushroom diet or what people were on the meat diet. So that's the blinded part of it. Obviously, if you're eating mushrooms, you're eating them. So they can't be double blinded, but it was single blind with regard to the nutritional counselors. So here's some results. Out of the 200, only 73 stayed to the end, okay? So about 36 in the mushroom diet and 37 in the standard diet. So one conclusion is that dieting is hard. People couldn't stay on this. People drop out. Another conclusion is that doing human studies, people drop out like crazy. Human studies are hard and expensive. These are really expensive studies to do. But here's some of the data that they found. So the mushroom group lost more weight, 7 pounds as opposed to 2 pounds. They lost some inches on their waist, a couple inches. The other group actually gained a couple inches, which is too bad. And they were healthier in a number of other regards. So they had decreased blood pressure, decreased cholesterol levels, decreased fasting glucose, triglycerides. C-reactive protein is a measure of inflammation in the body. It's a sort of inflammatory. It's not, low levels are good, high levels are not good. So in this case, people had lower levels. So all these things were positive. The only problem was that enough people had dropped out of the study that some of these numbers didn't reach the statistical significance that they were hoping for. Some still did. I think C-reactive protein and triglycerides, for example, were still statistically significant. But certainly the trends were in the right direction. It's really hard to get funding for these kinds of studies, right? Because they cost a lot. But the results looked great. So that's the nutritional stuff that I'm going to talk about. Now I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit about medicinal mushrooms. But honestly, I find that a really confusing term, and I don't think it gets defined very much, and I think, and so I'm going to talk about it. Okay, there are a number of mushrooms that are described as medicinal, and usually these have been designated as medicinal from Asian cultures. But what does that mean? So what are these mushrooms supposed to do, or what properties are they supposed to have? And what's the data behind that? Okay, so if I say this mushroom's good for you, show me the data. I really want to see the data. I want to know what's behind these claims. There's a lot of claims where there's not much behind them. There is a big scientific literature on medicinal mushrooms, but it's terrible to read. It's really difficult. There's a lot of crummy papers out there. As non-scientists, most of us are non-scientists in this room, I assume, you assume if it's in a scientific journal that, it's good science. Unfortunately, that's not the case. There's a number of studies that are just junk. So you really have to sift the wheat from the chaff and say, does this make sense? decent work? Do I believe it? And how does it relate? Let me just give you an example. For an example, you could find papers that say cancer cells grown in culture could be killed by mushroom extracts. And so you would say, oh my gosh, mushrooms can cure cancer, okay? But that's not enough to say that. It's really easy to kill cancer cells in a dish, okay? Cultured almost anything in your kitchen, if you were to dump into that tissue culture dish, it would kill the cancer cells. It would probably kill non-cancer cells too. But things like salt or sugar or and half the spices. So you really need context, and you really need, could you actually achieve the levels that you're getting in this dish in an animal? Is it actually absorbed? Is it toxic? I mean, there's a million things that you need to know. So a lot of the studies out there are just junk, and you actually have to try and sift through to find things that are meaningful. I've done some sifting, and everything I'm going to show you, I believe is meaningful. But there's plenty more stuff out there that I haven't had time to sift, okay? So, one of the claims that you see the most often are data that seem to support stimulation or modulation of the immune system, okay, in a good way. And usually these are due to complex carbohydrates, things that are called glucans. So if you take a bunch of, you've probably heard of glucose, where you talk about glucose levels in the blood. It's a simple sugar. It's in lots of things we eat. You can hook glucose molecules together in lots of different ways. If you hook them together one way, you make starch. If you hook them together in a different way, you make cellulose. If you hook them together in a different way, that's one of the things that mushrooms have in their cell walls, used to make their cell walls. And these compounds, beta-1,3 and beta-1,6 glucans, are present in the cell walls of pretty much all mushrooms. It turns out that our immune systems see that and react to it in a good way. We'll talk more about the immune system stuff in a minute. But there are then some other species, and that stuff's true for pretty much all mushrooms, right? Because all mushrooms have those compounds in their cell walls. So the mushrooms that tend to be called medicinal, so these are cultivated edible species. And these are the ones that are most often described as medicinal in terms of edible species, and you know most of these: shiitake, maitake, enoki, lion's mane, and then a mushroom that we don't see enough around the United States is an almond agaric, an almond mushroom, Agaricus subrufescens, or it has a couple of other names that people use for it as well. Okay, so these are in terms of cultivated edible mushrooms, these are the species most often talked about. Then there's a set of other mushrooms which are not really considered edible mushrooms because they're either too tough or too bitter for you to eat a big plate of. You wouldn't put it next to your steak. But people do consume them for their supposed medicinal properties. Okay, typically you would grind them up into a powder or make an extract or a tea or something. And these are things like reishi and turkey tail, the cordyceps or caterpillar fungus, and chaga. Okay, so not savory and delicious, but people have considered them to be medicinal. Okay, and I'm not going to tell you that they're not. I'm just going to go through some evidence for what we actually know. So let's talk more about the immune system. Again, that's the claim that you see most in the literature for medicinal mushrooms, is a boost in immune system function. And again, it's those particular carbohydrates, those glucans, that are thought to be the main factor in that. And those are sugars or carbohydrates, complex carbohydrates that we don't have, and we also can't break them down. We don't have enzymes to digest them. So that's fungal cell walls, basically just most of it just stays in your gut, and it becomes that insoluble fiber that our guts like. But there are some smaller fractions that, for some mushrooms, that can be absorbed. So we have, as part of our immune system, molecules that specifically look for those sugars and say, oh, you might be getting a fungus infection. We should let people know. I mean, we should react to that, okay? So we have pattern recognition receptors on the surface of macrophages and other antigen presenting cells that look for the sugar pattern that is specific for fungi. And some of these guys have names, Dectin-1, complement receptor 3. So sciencey stuff if you want it, it's there. But ultimately, you want to take a step back and ask, what does it do in people? Okay, so here's a nice study from a few years ago where they just gave people a bunch of shiitake and measured some immune system parameters before and after. Okay, so let's see. Consuming shiitake mushrooms daily improves human immunity. A randomized dietary intervention. The part that was randomized was they used 2 different doses, either 5 grams or 10 grams of dried shiitake. So 10 grams of dried shiitake is 100 grams wet, so it's that quarter pound amount, and asked them to eat that every day. And what they were looking for, since you would know if you were eating shiitake or not, they didn't give it to you in capsules, there's no way to blind that. So they thought they'd look for a dose-dependent effect. If they saw an immune system effect at one dose, and then maybe it'd be bigger at another dose. And they measured a bunch of stuff before and after. Turns out they didn't see that much difference in the 2 groups, but they did see big differences before the study and at the end of the month. And there were a number of things that improved. So there was increased secretory IgA, a type of antibody that's a measure of immune function, and they also measured some sort of exotic parameters looking at gamma delta T cells and natural killer T cells, and found that they were more reactive. But the body as a whole wasn't just feeling, oh my gosh, I've got an infection, I'm all inflamed. And so there were actually reduced general levels of inflammation. Okay, so here's that C-reactive protein, again, that we talked about, and that was lower. So this is really just what you want. The immune system is sort of more awake, doing more stuff, but you're not just generally sick and having an unhelpful inflammatory response. So inflammation, if you get a cut and you don't clean it, it gets red and sore and hurts, and that's inflammation. And you don't want your whole body like that. It's not good. So what I would like to suggest, though, is that this kind of response, this cell wall beta-glucan, you can see that from all mushrooms, right? It's not specific to just shiitake or just that list that I gave you. Those fungal cell walls are in all mushrooms. There may be differences, and this isn't very well studied, about how much of that gets out of your gut and into your body as opposed to your intestines, okay? So soluble, extractable stuff. This is just a sort of diagram of a cell wall, and we don't need to spend a lot of time on it, but here's those beta-glucans. There's a layer. You may know that chitin is a macromolecule that's in fungi, and that's there too. This is just to highlight the fact that fungal cell walls are pretty similar in many ways. Okay, so in addition to just cell walls, a lot of mushrooms have specific compounds that are interesting as well. So statin drugs, which are taken by a very large number of people in our society, things like Lipitor, Mevacor, those were originally described from mushrooms, and they're present, for example, in oyster mushrooms. Those things are good for people with high levels of cholesterol, which tends to be most of us eating a Western diet. Okay, so that's all the immune system stuff I want to spend time on right now. Then I'm going to switch systems and talk a little bit about the nervous system. There's a number of studies that suggest beneficial results of different kinds of mushrooms on the nervous system. Okay, and the one that you may have seen that seems to have the most specific associated with it is lion's mane, or Hericium marinaceus. Okay, this is a study, don't try and read all this. This is a study where it's again, tissue culture cells in a dish, so you can only take it so far. But what they did, they grew a particular kind of cell that is basically like a glial cell. So glial cells are support for neurons in the brain. And one of the ways that glial cells can support neurons is by secreting factors that neurons like. And in particular, this study looked at a factor called nerve growth factor, which is required for some kinds of neurons to stay alive and also to make connections. And what they did was they took extracts of several kinds of mushrooms. So the hericium, the lion's mane, eringi, this is king oyster, which is a delicious cultivated species, maitake, and that almond mushroom that's also quite delicious. And they took those extracts and put them in these tissue culture dishes along with the mammalian cells, and they found that specifically in response to the hericium, to the lion's mane, those cells made nerve growth factor. They secreted it out into the media. So those cells reacted to the mushroom extract by producing something that neurons like. So that sounds really good. And it seems to be really good. They then went on to give mice a bunch of lion's mane, dried lion's mane, 5% of their diet in dry powder, so a big dose. And they found effects in mice too. So they found increased levels of NGF messenger RNA in brain regions. So it looked like, in fact, this goes beyond the tissue culture dish, which is terrific. And then this study looked in people, and it's a lovely study. The only thing I have against it is that it was not very many people, but it's exactly the kind of study that you would love to have. Unfortunately, these studies are really expensive, but let's just look at it for a minute. This is a double-blinded, placebo-controlled clinical trial. This is the gold standard of medical trials. This is absolutely what you want to rely on as data, whether something does something or not in people. So they took 30 volunteers, and these were elderly Japanese who had mild cognitive impairment. Okay, so not enough to be institutionalized, but had some issues. Okay, and they gave them a bunch of pills that had dried lion's mane, 3 grams a day. So they gave them a gram 3 times a day. And the other half had similar pills, but just sugar pills, basically. So the patients don't know what kind of pills they're getting, and the researchers don't know what kind of pills they're getting either. Until the end of the study. And then they gave them questionnaires and evaluated them to see how they're doing at various times. And what they found was at the beginning of the study, so this is some measure of how well they did on the exams they were taking, and this is time. And so at the beginning, they're pretty similar. And then over time, at a couple months, 3 months, 4 months, the group taking the hericium did significantly better. And then once the trial had stopped, they followed them another month, and it actually started to fall off again. But this is wonderful data. The only thing I have against it is that the numbers are so small. Okay? So again, this is the gold standard kind of study. This is what you'd love to see. But it's small number. The problem is nobody will pay for this kind of study unless you're a drug company and can make money off of it. Nobody can make money off of lion's mane mushrooms, which you can just grow. I mean, they're not that difficult to grow, so you can't make the kind of money. You can make some money, but you can't make the kind of money that funds studies like this. So you would love to see follow-ups with bigger numbers of people, and they're not out there. But it looks great. This is really encouraging. Okay, here's another ergo molecule that I'm going to talk about. We're going to talk about a molecule called ergothioneine. And it turns out this is an anti-inflammatory molecule that's made by fungi and a few kinds of soil bacteria. And it was discovered when people were studying ergot for all the toxins, but we didn't really know what it did until really recently. So it's been sitting around as a known molecule, but it's like, okay, so what? Who cares? Pictures of it in case you like chemical diagrams. Compounds with free sulfhydryls tend to just react spontaneously with air in solution, and so they don't stay around very long. This one does. This one stays around for a while. And the really interesting thing is our bodies have a specific gene that makes a specific transport protein that is made only for this stuff. Our bodies are waiting for this molecule to take it up. So here is a demonstrating the specificity of that transport. So you absorb it from the diet, and it gets into cells, and we seem to want it. And it looks like it's an anti-stress factor. It's an antioxidant, and it protects cells from oxidative stress. Here's another paper. Again, don't try and read it. We'll just read the title. The unusual amino acid L-ergothioneine is a physiologic cytoprotectant. What they did was test cells in culture, basically, again, and found that ergothioneine can protect cells from oxidative stress. And they actually argue that this should be considered a vitamin. It's something we get from our diet and we use. We can't make it. And only fungi make it. Actually, plants take it up from the soil, too. So you do get some ergothioneine from plant sources. They don't make it, though, but they'll take it up a little bit from soil bacteria. But mushrooms are the biggest source of this compound, and it seems to be good for us. So here's a study where they looked at ergothioneine blood levels. So how much ergothioneine do people have, and does it change over time? And they found that ergothioneine levels tended to decrease over time. So here's that decrease over time, just looking what's in people's blood. Remember, this is good for you, so you would like to have a lot of it. And then the other thing they found, they then looked in a smaller group of the people in that study that had mild cognitive impairment, and they found those people had levels that were even lower than the rest of their age group. Okay, so whatever age you were, if you had mild cognitive impairment, you had less of this around. People with mild cognitive impairment had less than the normal when you age matched in that setting. Here's a different study out of Singapore, and here they were just looking at what do people eat, and so just your normal diet, and is there any relationship with mild cognitive impairment? And they found basically the more mushrooms people ate, the less likely they were to have mild cognitive impairment. Here's the result. So if you ate more mushrooms, mushroom consumption portions per week, you were less likely to have mild cognitive impairment. And specifically, they found if you ate 2 servings per week, you were less than half as likely to develop mild or to have mild cognitive impairment compared to people eating 1 serving or less. And this is not the only study that shows this. This is a pretty recent study, but it's not the only one. So this is just some more details of that same study. So they looked at more than 600 people. So this is the data from the study I just told you. And mushroom consumption was all mushrooms, but in this case, the mushrooms people were eating were basically button mushrooms, shiitake, and oyster, and it could be either fresh, dried, or canned. The people who were just asked to report what they ate. And as I mentioned, this isn't the only study that's found this. So here's a study out of Norway. They looked at 2,000 elderly Norwegians. And it's not quite looking at the same thing. They're not looking at mild cognitive impairment now, but they're doing a measure of cognitive performance, and that improved linearly with mushroom consumption. So the more mushrooms people ate, the better they did on whatever these cognitive performance measurements were done. And here's another study out of Japan, where they looked at a very large number, 13,000 Japanese, elderly Japanese, and again, mushroom consumption, the more mushrooms you ate, you had a decreased risk of dementia. Here in the West, when we think of medicines, we usually think it as something that treats specific symptoms. Okay, so if I have a stuffy nose, I might take a decongestant and it will clear up my stuffy nose. But when you translate that to mushrooms, it doesn't really work. It's not like you would take this mushroom if your muscles are sore, or this mushroom if you have a stuffy nose. So instead, I like the idea of calling mushrooms functional foods, foods that have additional health benefits beyond just the nutritional qualities. So they just do more, they do generally healthy things, but it's not, they're not specifically a medicine that you take for a specific symptom. But they absolutely seem to be good for us. just a few conclusions from the talk. Okay, so mushrooms are low in calories, fats, and sodium. They're good dietary sources of protein, some vitamins and minerals, and dietary fiber. They can be a good weight reduction strategy if you substitute mushrooms for higher energy density foods. Okay, we saw that. Mushrooms are the richest source of that antioxidant or new vitamin called ergothioneine. And mushroom consumption may have additional health benefits, including immune system modulation and stimulation and promotion of neurologic health. Okay. Thank you.